Welcome back, everybody. It's week 15 of the spring semester 2020. We're doing Social Work 140A. Here's the first class, and as we did over the last couple weeks, we'll be meeting by Zoom on Thursday. And so I'm going to be going through all of the questions and the outline, and hopefully what you can have for me is your participation sheet out in front of you. Because of course this slide presentation is cued to it very tightly. So I think that's been a pretty good working model for us. And I think the other thing is what I'm about to go into. I'll go ahead and flip the slide for you. So I felt like last week we did really well with the Zoom meeting, having a little more structure with respect to looking at some questions during the week while we're reviewing the chapter. So I'm going to go ahead and read these to you. These are also the questions that appear on your participation sheet as the first item. Please consider and prepare a response to the following questions for our Zoom meeting on Thursday, April 30th. Okay, number 1. From the scenario at the opening of the chapter, what lets the social work team of Consuela Diaz and Daryl Foster know that it is time to, quote, take another step back? Okay. There's a pretty clear indication to them, at least, that it's probably a good time for them to take another step back. And I'm just kind of curious, why was that mentioned? What in the context of the situation let them know that it was time to take another step back? And how does that fit into the bigger picture of what we're trying to do as social workers from an empowerment model, working with both individuals and groups? Number 2, from the context clues, what kind of group does the Community Action Council seem to be? What kinds of activities do they undertake? You kind of have some embedded clues in that first scenario. Number 3, at the formation of the Community Action Council, what skills do you suspect Consuela and Daryl needed to have in order to promote its success? Okay. Number 4, what does the Community Action Council seem more like, a mutual aid or self-help group? What leads you to your conclusion, and what clues do you have? Should be do you have, not do you have. Okay, number 5, how does the example of the group of single mothers on page 331 integrate a solution-focused approach into a mutual aid setting? So I know there's a little bit of some overlap here, but the scenario on page 331 is talking about a group of single mothers. I'm wondering how you can see a solution-focused approach at work in the mutual aid setting that this group takes place in. Number 6, in what ways does the example of the psychoeducational support group for adolescent girls in a correctional facility, that's on page 322, illustrate how a mutual support group can benefit its members? So again, you have some clues here, and it's also asking you to do a little bit of critical thinking. In what ways does this particular group seem to illustrate how its members can benefit from the mutual support? What are some specifics you can come up with? And number 7, how did the group of Latino and African American mothers, and again described on page 334, evolve from a mutual aid to social action group? And I think that if you haven't already read the chapter, some of these terms, mutual aid, social action group, are going to become a little more defined throughout today's presentation. So hopefully you've already read, but if not, these terms should be crystal clear by the time we get through the end of today's lecture, and I think that they'll set you up nicely to be able to answer these questions as well. Okay, we're going to journey through the slides now with an outline of Chapter 13. It tracks, again, I think very tightly, your participation sheet for the week, as it should. And we're going to start with Roman numeral 1, developing alliances through small groups. And we're going to take a look at what alliances are. Alliances are, as defined by our text, the synergistic resource created by collaboration between worker and client. Now, synergistic is going to depend on the energies of both parties. Again, so it's fitting that we're also using the term collaboration. So anytime you have synergy, it's usually going to be between two or more groups, and the energy is going to kind of feed off one another. So that's what an alliance is being defined as in our particular text. B, these are often connections with these are often connections with other clients, agencies, or organizations who have similar concerns, contain supportive relationships with natural supports, and feature professional networks. Okay, a little bit more of an add-on there. Okay, and take a look at this. Clients can experience support from alliances such as client groups, natural support networks. We're going to be spending a little bit of time talking about that, especially near the end. Okay, case management between client and social worker, agency coalitions, and when you think of that, you kind of get the picture in your mind of more than one agency kind of coming together for a common goal. So you'll have different people from different agencies, but again, united through a common purpose. Okay, social worker commonly facilitate the development of alliances through groups such as mutual aid groups, self-help groups. And really, I think that tonight, or I mean, for you guys watching this today, mutual aid groups and self-help groups are really going to share a spotlight for this particular chapter. So it's good that we're kind of going through these at an even pace. Okay, so next up, we're going to be talking about the role of groups and empowerment and how they fit with one another. I'm going to start with this item for social work. Groups can be vehicles for personal growth, skill development, and environmental change. So with social work, as you know, client systems can vary from individuals all the way up to societies, and group work, which I find to be very powerful, can be vehicles for all these things: personal growth, skill development, and environmental change. We'll continue to talk about what we mean by these things as we go along. Okay, how do these things work? Well, with groups, they also allow members to develop, critical thinking skills. So a lot of times people get a fairly vague or shallow notion of what occurs within a group. If you look at what actually is happening among members in groups, frequently one thing they are doing is they're developing skills. If they're there for a common purpose, they're listening and they're responding, and in between they're thinking. And I think that groups can be a wonderful forum for helping members sharpen critical thinking skills. Receive information and validation. Being a member of a group, you do receive quite a bit of information, sometimes about yourself, and also validation if it's a group that is for the purpose of its members, which most functioning groups are. You're going to get these two components, information and validation. So another great reason, or a pair of reasons, to be a member of a group. Okay. Organize a power base from which to advocate for change in larger social systems. We'll see how that can be a little bit activated later, but all of these are skills, and all of these are phenomena that can take place in the context of a group. So we're going to talk about what a lot of social workers do, which is facilitating group functioning. So social workers should have a fairly strong understanding of what group dynamics are and mean, and how they can be, let me bring up the next one. Social workers are charged with maximizing, that's really the word I was looking for, maximizing the benefits of group functioning. We really should be in a position to help groups function at their highest capacity, and that takes a skill set from us. And I think what it does is the skill set from us should be one that allows other people to be activated. So it's a skill set that's helping others realize roles, potential, so on and so forth. That's part of facilitating a group, and specifically facilitating group functioning. Okay, to do so, social workers use the following core skills. Okay, conceptualize and initiate the group. So a lot of times, especially with mutual aid groups, it's the social worker who might see connections or might identify a problem that he, she, or they notice is happening among clients they're working with and suggest maybe having a group. So even knowing when maybe a group is appropriate is a skill. Develop the system of mutual aid. That's a definite skill. That's being able to look where one person has a need and then maybe finding another person who has a need, but then also showing that they can be mutual resources for each other. Okay, this is a big one, number 3. What do social workers do in terms of core skills? Mediate interactions among group members and between the group and the larger environment. So social workers are active not only in the context of helping the group function among its members, but then also helping the group interact in the larger environment. Some groups form through a commonly identified need. Okay, I mentioned that earlier. Others form as a result of a targeted social issue. I'm thinking of like Black Lives Matter would be a targeted social issue. I'm thinking of, for example, another one that you might say hospice is a targeted social issue. Commonly identified needs, when you have people who are in need of maybe even bereavement, or if a community went through some kind of a traumatic event, there's a commonly identified need there. I think that 9/11 is a great example of when you had groups coming together to help people heal from that disaster. So again, you can kind of see how social workers play a pretty strong role in all of this. Continuing along that same line of thought, we're going to go to our next. We're going to go to our next point now. After a group is envisioned, social workers engage in pre-group tasks to launch it. This is a pretty time-intensive and I think labor-intensive kind of act on the part of the social work. When you get into 140B and C, you learn a lot more about putting groups together and the skill set and also the time it takes to kind of get groups launched. It's not an easy thing by any stretch, but it's also very powerful when it can happen. So let's go ahead and talk about this. Repeat what I just said. After a group is envisioned, workers engage in pre-group tasks to launch it, including developing a proposal. That's not uncommon. I mean, it's almost like having a business plan. It's the blueprint for how you want to proceed, and I think that all well thought out groups are typically going to need one. I can share stories about a group that was formed at Families First while I was there by a very close friend of mine. Had to deal with children who had been sexually traumatized. It was a very powerful group, but again, it came as a result of developing a proposal. And it took a good I remember how long they put in that. It was a good 3 months doing research and figuring out interventions and how this group should look. I mean, it took a lot of energy. Number 2, receiving sponsorship. Typically, groups are not going to go on in parks. They're going to be in the auspices of agencies, in the space of agencies. They're not going to be going on just anywhere. So wherever you are working or whoever you need to work with, it doesn't matter whether it's a YMCA or Families First, like I mentioned earlier with my earlier example, you're probably going to need to have somebody checking off a box, allowing you the space and the resources to get the thing going, and that's probably going to be wound up in the proposal as well. So receiving sponsorship is going to be a targeted act for social workers. Assessing and screening participants. Let's be completely honest. There are times where group members are appropriate and other times are not for specific groups. So the process of accessing or finding and screening participants is again a very large act and takes a lot of time and thought. And I think this is one of these things where you really want to do it right. You don't want to haphazardly just kind of say, well, we'll just take anyone in this group. I think you really have to be targeted and intentional about who you're seeing as being beneficial to the group and benefiting from the group. It really has to be a two-way street. Otherwise, there are plenty of stories of disasters, which, again, you don't really need to proceed down that path. Orienting members to the group. So once you've assessed, you've accessed your pool or your population of participants, screened them, then you go into the process of orienting the members to the group. And again, I have to say, as kind of a little bit of a teaser trailer, these are the type of things that we're going to be talking about, or you're going to be talking about when you get to your 140B and especially your 140C class. So it's always kind of exciting. Next one, social workers facilitate the initial group process through directing members' interactions toward each other. You really cannot go into a group assuming that your members know how to interact with each other. That's a very dangerous assumption. You may think to yourself, well, they've been to school, or they've interacted in social interactions. Surely they know how to interact. No, I wouldn't make that assumption. Sometimes you have to be a bit of a guide. It's not always easy for people, to come to a group and interact in a way that they feel safe, but then also interact in a way that is appropriate for the group. I think sometimes that takes some guidance on the part of the social worker. Helping group members respond to one another. Well, you can promote interaction, but you can also help with responses. And sometimes you can get folks who are not accustomed to responding in any way that's constructive. And, I think those people require some patience on your part. You really kind of have to say, well, what's a good way to respond to that? And I don't think it's a bad thing at all to make process comments throughout working with people in the context of a group and saying, well, you heard what this person said over here. How would you like to respond to that? And in what way do you think would be the most constructive? I don't think those are bad questions. They're actually, I think, quite helpful to get group members thinking not only about what they want to say, but how they want to say it. Because, again, that's a skill set that people could pick up as a result of being part of members of a group. And that goes to this third point fairly directly: developing respectful and functional group norms. Again, if you're facilitating a group, helping the group understand how they can be respectful and function is part of your job. Helping them realize that this is not just a gripe session. You can vent, that's fine, but ultimately at the end of the day, if all you have is pure chaos, I'm not sure that anyone will probably want to come back. So again, helping people find a purpose and helping people find a way to pursue the purpose, and that I think is done by developing respectful and functional group norms. Highlighting members' common characteristics and concerns. I think this is gold. Anytime in the course of a group session you're able to point out common characteristics or needs or concerns that folks have, and you link them with each other, or you connect one person's responses to another's and ask if they notice that connection, that's just a really good way to process a group. That's really a great way to help group members feel like they're fitting in, I guess communicating effectively. You're really helping them train themselves on a new skill base. Helping members to remain on task. Now that's one that has to start with the worker. I think the worker also can't get sucked into being kind of sidetracked or tangential. Social workers, in part, while you can allow for some, say venting or some maybe brainstorming, I think remaining on a task is part of what we're trying to do too. We're trying to kind of keep people guided. That's a hard thing to do sometimes. Networking appropriate resources and information. This can go on within the group and without the group. In other words, outside the group. Social workers can figure out what other things in terms of resources and information would be helpful and useful to the group and help the group access it. That could be maybe even helping people in the group find tasks or help guide them into doing tasks and then reporting back to the group. Or, if it's something that's in the social worker's purview, the social worker can do some direct action as well. But I also think it's really helpful process to help the clients learn to access the information and resources they need themselves, because the idea is that the group won't always be needed. Implementing goal-oriented activities. That, again, this all fits together. In my last statement, number 6, again, any time you can help the group implement goal-oriented activities where the members themselves are part of the process of achieving whatever the goal is through activities that they're doing both in and out of the group, that's a winner. That's I think a fairly helpful and useful group for the members. Okay, when we're talking about what facilitation requires, we're talking broadly about skill sets. Key skills used by social workers for this process are conflict resolution. Not everyone's going to agree. Don't forget that one of the natural life stages to a group is storming. I mentioned that a few weeks ago. So helping the group manage its own crisis or conflicts, or being able to resolve in a way that is, again, going back to number 3 up here, respectful and functional. I think that's a key skill for social workers. Facilitating decision making, and again, when you're helping a group with its process, you're helping the group process information and hopefully come out with a satisfying outcome for the group. Part of that is helping facilitate the decision making process. You're talking about a lot of moving parts when you're talking about people, and helping them discover a process by which they, as a group, can make a decision. Again, it's a skill set for the individuals, but then also how to function in a group, and largely those are very employable skills. Stimulating creativity. I think this one's undersold. I think that groups are reservoirs of creativity if they're used correctly, and I think trying to stimulate the creativity, you could have a group full of people from very diverse sectors of life and industry and upbringing and backgrounds, and being able to help them tap into their experiences in a creative way. There's nothing better, really, in terms of the functioning of the group. Helping stimulate creativity that everyone's going to bring to the group is a very strong skill set for social workers. Okay, now we're going to begin this slide by taking a look at what we mean by mutual aid in groups. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation altogether that mutual aid groups and also self-help groups are going to kind of share a spotlight for this chapter, as will case management skills later. But for now, mutual aid in groups, what do we mean by this? How does that function? What are some qualities, characteristics of that? I'm going to be referring to our book a little bit during this part, so I'm going to be opened on page 331. That's where it's really talking about mutual aid in groups and mutual aid processes. So the book identifies 9 qualities of mutual aid process to empower group members. And the first is sharing data. Basically, in the way the book states, it provides group members with opportunities to benefit from the knowledge and resources each member contributes. I mentioned that earlier when I was talking about the sharing of information in groups, and also trying to promote critical thinking. People are exposed to more data, more information in groups. They have the ability to process it in new ways, maybe hear different perspectives and points of view that they hadn't been exposed to in the past, which is clearly kind of a mind-opening experience if a person is willing to allow it to be. The second one is dialectic process. Now, again, so much of what I'm talking today kind of fits in like a nice little puzzle. The book describes the dialectical process as point and counterpoint discussions in which members articulate and synthesize divergent views. Well, let's break that sentence down. Point and counterpoint. So you've got different perspectives on maybe the same topic. And then it talks about discussions in which members articulate, so they can kind of say to themselves and to others, and synthesize divergent views. So bringing maybe ideas that are not necessarily in agreement into some kind of a consensus, or maybe forming something new. So you take one perspective A and another perspective B, and somehow between the two of them you find yet a third C. I think that's what the dialectic process really is all about. It's like synthesis, anti-synthesis, new thesis. Okay. So again, I like the way they describe that, the dialectical process, and that's definitely something that can happen in a group. But as you can kind of recall back, I think the process is important, and I think the process has to be respectful and functional. Okay. Next one, ability to discuss taboos. Well, if you know anything about taboos, what's it say here in the book? It's talking about the abilities of some members to begin to talk about taboo subjects, lend courage to others to do the same. So taboos, things that we typically don't talk about in most company, or things that are, we're not supposed to talk about. When you have a group that's safe and you have a group that is trusting, you can begin to explore things that people don't talk about and really make some headway. There are certain things that people just don't talk about in most situations if they're making small talk at the grocery, or maybe they don't even feel safe talking about them in front of their families. The groups provide an opportunity for you to explore your notions or your ideas about subjects that are otherwise fairly off limits. So that's, I think, what we mean by ability to discuss taboos. Okay. Mutual exchanges. Again, this whole idea of point counterpoint. One of the mutual aid processes is mutual exchanges. You have exchanges of information, ideas, probably affect. There's a lot there that's going on at once. I think that that's one of the benefits of having a group versus saying, just, for example, if I was just going to say individual work between a client and a worker, that's that can be very powerful, but a group can also help promote, as we're seeing here, mutual exchanges in a way that maybe work between a social worker and a client just can't. So again, there's some flexibility in group work that you don't have other places. Mutual supports. When you have a group of people around you who are either in the same boat you are, or understand, or attempting to understand how you feel, or you're all there for a common purpose, you can feel a sense of support, and you can also give that same sense of support to others. And the whole experience can be very powerful for people who are members of a group where they feel supported. Maybe that's one of the only sources of support they've ever felt in their life. So again, that is one the book talks about. Mutual support flows through individual members as well as the group as a whole, and has reciprocal effects. That's kind of where I was headed with that. Number 6, mutual demands. The book says mutual demand confronts the need to make changes and holds members accountable for taking action. So if you are in a group and you are signing up for a task, or you are taking on a certain activity, there's a certain level of accountability that a group holds that you don't have necessarily as an individual. So there is a mutual demand, and of course you as a member of the group have the right to have a demand on other members if you're all trying to work toward the same goal. So again, mutual demand can be another form of cooperation where you have individual accountability and group accountability, and they're all going to be synchronous. The group accountability is going to be contingent on how the individuals are behaving as well. Okay. In addition to group functioning, we have individual problem solving, and the book notes individual problem solving occurs when work in the group moves back and forth between specific cases and general ideas. And so you have people who have maybe common issues, but there's different ways to solve them. And you have somebody presenting how they've been trying to do something and it hasn't been working. And then you have another person who says, well, I once had that problem too, and then I started doing this over here, which is a little different, and I had a different level of success. And that can be really liberating for people to hear something new and say, wow, I haven't tried that before, and maybe that's something I can learn from. You think about people who go to support groups for folks where there is maybe a social worker facilitating a group for bereavement, or families of folks who suffer from dementia, anything like that. Again, if people are struggling to cope with the situation, they can learn a lot about themselves by talking about it, but then they can also learn a lot about how to cope better by listening to what other people are doing. Rehearsal. The word rehearsal, the way the book uses it, rehearsal, yeah, this is exactly what I was going to say it if the book hadn't said it in this specific way. Rehearsal is a role-play strategy for practicing new behaviors in a context where support and feedback can increase members' confidence in their abilities to change. That is undeniably one of the greatest points that a group, or one of the greatest strengths a group can have, is the ability for people to role-play and try out new behaviors in a safe environment, so they don't have to feel like they're going at everything cold in life. They can kind of visualize themselves doing something new and then practice it in a safe setting. It's kind of like having training wheels on a bike. But then they can also receive feedback about how, if they're trying out a new behavior, they're being received by the group members. So again, rehearsal, the way that the book frames it, can be a very strong way that a group helps support members. Strength in numbers. I know it's not just the Golden State Warriors, right? Strength in numbers. I think there's this certain sense of confidence that can grow when people see that they're around other people who are trying to cope with the same situation, or working with the same set of circumstances, or are dealing with the same barriers. This could be anything as macro as systemic, racist institutions, all the way down to trying to cope with the death of a friend. I mean, there's lots of ways that the number of people around you can help improve your confidence, especially when you feel like you're connected to them and you're not alone. Okay. Now this is where we can draw a little bit of a contrast between what we mean by mutual aid and self-help groups. And this is where the book draws some distinctions, and I think the distinctions are spot on. In general, these groups, self-help groups, form when individuals with similar concerns or situations join together to be resources to one another. Social workers are often not instrumental in creating these groups. In other words, self-help groups are largely self-forming groups that are not necessarily orchestrated by social workers, at least at the beginning, and oftentimes not ever. Social workers just, we're not really invited unless we were a member of the group. But that doesn't mean they can't be powerful. Self-help groups are incredibly well known, and they're bedrock for a lot of people who are seeking help. Let's take a look at what we mean by this. Here's some examples of these groups. You've heard of them, I'm sure. Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not facilitated by a social worker. It's facilitated by and for folks who are trying to recover from alcoholism. And I would say the same thing for Al-Anon, which is for family members of people who suffer, family members of people who suffer from alcoholism. How are family members who are trying to support this person coping? Okay, that would be Al-Anon. So again, that would also be a self-help group, or an example of one. Okay, Parents Without Partners is another one that you may have heard of. So again, this is, if it's self-help, again, you're not going to go in there finding a professional running it. You're typically going to have people who have been through it or are actively in it, whatever the issue is, orchestrating and running and facilitating the groups. And I'll be the first to tell you, there's a lot of variety and diversity within these groups. And if you work with people who have been alcoholics, you'll find that they have had some AA meetings that have worked really well for them, and maybe they've been to some others that weren't as well done. And you're going to get that, But the point of it is that self-help groups are in fact very powerful insofar as people are usually aware of some of them and seek them out, and the people there are not going to be there to judge them at all, because they're all going to realize they're all in the same boat, just at some maybe different level on the rung of a ladder. NAMI, or the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. These are both consumers and family members of consumers of mental health services who come together. But again, it's very largely a self-help group. It's not staged or organized by social workers. It's families and friends and the people who are suffering themselves. So these are self-help groups in all the ways they look. So after that last slide, you might be asking, okay, well, if social workers are not facilitating typically or envisioning and forming and developing self-help groups, what kind of role do they have with self-help groups? And the book talks to that to a large extent. We'll start with that, working with self-help groups for social workers. Because of the known benefits of self-help groups, social workers do well to link clients to these groups. So even if we don't necessarily form them ourselves or necessarily get overly involved in them, that doesn't mean that we don't have a role with them. We do. We link people to them. In fact, you can get to know folks at self-help groups and become kind of feeders for them. Not that you're trying to profit from it, but what I mean by that is that you're able to form connections with people from these groups where even if you're not leading it, you make relationships so that you can refer people more easily. That's the main thing. Okay, so to be effective in doing so, our text recommends that social workers do these steps. Number one, or A, develop a file with descriptions of these groups. Now, this is one of these front-loading activities where if you take the time to do it, it pays dividends later. Creating a Rolodex, people don't use those anymore. Okay, creating a file with brochures, handouts. Heck, this is what I meant earlier by getting to know somebody at one of these self-help groups. They can help you. Of course, everything seems to be on a website nowadays, but still being able to somehow organize links, or ways to connect with and connect the clients to these places. That's going to be a good file to develop when you're starting out, just about anywhere you work as a social worker. Identify key participants in local groups. My gosh, it's me repeating myself. It's really good to know about groups, but it's even better to know people who are connected with them. It makes it easier to have a face and a name than just kind of guessing. I usually ask when I'm trying to figure out referrals for folks if there's contacts. If I'm if I'm in an area where I find a new service is being offered and it's a self-help group, the one thing I might do when I'm inquiring about it is ask, oh, okay, so who's the main contact here? So if somebody was going to say make a referral, how would they go about that? It's a good way to learn who's kind of the operators and the organizers within a self-help group. Discuss benefits with clients. You can talk kind of like I've been talking today, and the book was describing about the benefits of self-help groups. Being able to talk to the client about what they offer. It's just another one of these things where it's informed consent. There's many, many ways to get help. There's many avenues that people can pursue, and sometimes some are better than others. There are some people who will tell you up and down, I am not a group person. That's what they'll say to you, and maybe they're not. There are other people who have never tried groups and would benefit largely if they did. So discussing the benefits with clients is actually a decent policy. When you're going through the assessment process and you're beginning after the assessment process to kind of put together a plan with objectives and the goals, and you're considering resources. Some of the resources you consider for the action plan could in fact be self-help groups, and one of the objectives could be so-and-so will attend at least 2 groups a week or a month for the next 6 months. That's something that could be an objective in an action plan. Okay, but either way, discussing the benefits with clients is a good policy. Provide current information and brochures. I got to tell you, admittedly, there have been times where I swore up and down there was a service, and when I went out to look for it, it was not there. It's not a good thing to do with a client in the car. I'll say that right there. Make sure you do the footwork ahead of time if you're going to refer somebody. Don't take a shot in the dark and say, well, I think they're still open. I can recall very well a time in Vallejo when I was hoping to make a referral for somebody to an agency, and one of my colleagues and I went out and tried to find the place, but found out that it either wasn't in existence or the building was being remodeled, but nonetheless, the information we had for the agency was not current and not up to date and would have been highly misleading and frustrating for a client. So again, being able to make sure that you provide current information and updated brochures for clients is going to be a key for you. And it's the same thing here. Accurate referral information. This would include things like phone numbers, websites, people who are contacts that it would be a good idea for you to, even if you think you know, reach out and say, oh, is so-and-so still there? And do we still make referrals to that person? It's good just to make sure you have a tight beam, kind of a tight line between your referral for the client and the referral source, or I'm sorry, and the referral provider, whatever agency you're referring to. That is, I think, something that really also helps you stay professional, helps you look professional as well. People tend to lose faith and confidence in workers when they're referred to places that don't exist, or some hasn't been updated in 6 months or 3 years or something. Yeah, it's a bad look. I wouldn't do it. I think it's like I said, a cautionary tale. Always make sure you check, just kind of like I did that one agency, and boy, that would have been embarrassing if we had referred clients there and it didn't exist. Okay, enough said. Social action through group work. It is possible to convert efforts that are made initially for the goal of mutual aid toward a much bigger picture. So instead of focusing on the micro or meso, you can move into the meso-macro type of environment through group work as well, and the book talks about that. And I just restate that here. Besides individual change, mutual aid groups can provide a conduit for social action. These groups are called social action groups. Yes, that makes sense, doesn't it? And form for the purpose of targeting change at the meso and macro levels. And let me just revise that a little bit. They can also not only form for that purpose, but they can become that purpose, over time. So it could be that there is an initial push for kind of a mutual aid format or purpose. But then after a while, you find, well, actually, more work can be done here. We can be doing work on a greater level, meso and macro. Participation in these groups often offer members heightened sense of competence. Yes, this goes back to exchange of ideas, strength in numbers, feeling like you have people who are all working on the same goal or the same issue or situation. People who are collecting a lot of data or information, resources. You build your competence. It's something that can really help somebody feel, again, part of something bigger. Natural support alliances. Again, something that I think gets undersold quite a bit. In the last agency I worked at, we spent quite a bit of time trying to help clients not only identify but develop natural support alliances. We did this a lot, and it became, almost a focus week to week of trying to help our clients build those kind of networks. What's this mean? Well, natural supports are often overlooked and include, well, here's some of them, informal systems, family, friends, neighbors, coworkers. Okay, it's hard to believe that, although it does exist, this situation does exist, it's hard to believe that people have nobody at all, at any point, at any time, and never have. Instead, you may find that there are people who have let lines go dead. And there may be people on the other end who are willing to, reconnect. So again, it's hard for me to believe that nobody has nobody in their life right now and never has. That's just really a hard thing for me to wrap my head around. So even if you're exploring in the assessment phase with clients, informal systems, and you ask about people who are close to them, even if they aren't, you could say, well, what happened? Is it possible that you could reconnect with those people? Or is there someone who maybe you've kind of lost touch with, but would still probably be happy to hear from you, or would be at least supportive if they knew what you kind of needed? again, that's one way to kind of frame it and approach it. Membership systems. These are commonly churches, associations, clubs. These are where people have already, there's already kind of a formal structure. Again, there's some kind of an organization, a lot of times kind of a building that people would go to or meet at. That's what, again, a natural support might look like otherwise. Finally, professional systems, social workers, educators, lawyers, doctors, these are all part of natural supports that can come about. But the ones that we really tried to help people develop when I was working with the severely chronically mentally ill in my last go round was the first two. We spent a lot of time with especially informal systems and maybe secondarily membership systems. But they were both very important to clients and really should be considered a focus of any kind of an action plan. Social supports for natural supports provide. What do they provide? Decreased isolation. That's not surprising. So again, the more natural supports you have, typically the less isolated you are. First-hand knowledge of culture, strengths, and community needs. Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is that natural supports are generally going to have a better idea, about what's needed in a community than just one opinion or just one idea. A lot of times you have, groups of ideas or groups of people who share common knowledge of, these areas, and they're going to be really important to help a client move through whatever situation he, she, or they is going through. Strong social supports can help to mitigate crisis for clients. That's really important. The research and the literature shows that when there is a crisis, the sooner you can help somebody get out of it or at least return to pre-crisis stability, the less detrimental effects you tend to see over a long-term period. So again, that's something I'm going to mention when we talk on Thursday. So even though we have the sheet by now completed, some of these points I'm going to reiterate when we meet on Thursday. Because I think they're worth, again, remembering and going over and fleshing out with a few more examples and details. So anyway, hope that was helpful to you. And please don't forget that what I'll be looking forward to seeing from you on Thursday is responses to those questions, which, again, even those questions tailor nicely to some of these things we've been covering even in the last couple slides. So we're going to get a little bit of a workout here with this material, which is good. Because there's a lot to cover. So I will talk to you guys on Thursday and look forward to seeing you.